In this video, we're going to talk about the 2021 film, No Time to Die. The 20th and final film of the Daniel Craig era and the 25th Eon-produced James Bond film. And warning, spoiler alert. This film wraps up the epic story of the life of this incredible man known as James Bond, but the film where the filmmakers managed to do something that none of the previous James Bond villains had been able to do, and that is kill James Bond. Was No Time to Die the perfect swan song to Daniel Craig's incredible run as James Bond, or did it soil his legacy? I'm going to talk about the complicated production of this incredible but controversial film, and I'm going to explore the rumor that Saffin was really supposed to be Dr. Julius No. Spoiler alert, I actually think he was. The beginnings of No Time to Die began in February of 2016 when the film officially entered pre-production, and screenwriters Neal Purvis and Robert Wade, who had worked on every Bond film since The World Is Not Enough, were hired to write the script. However, the most concerning factor was whether Daniel Craig would return as Bond.
I've read that it'll be your last. Will this be your last?
I don't know.
The burning question, will it be your last one? Who knows?
Are you going to stay? Are you going to go?
I don't know.
Hammer it out?
I just don't know. The honest answer is I don't know.
I don't know.
Because back in 2015, immediately after filming Spectre, he said in a famous interview that he would rather slash his wrists than play Bond again. And apparently, Daniel Craig really took a beating on the set and sustained a lot of physical injuries. Also, during the filming of Quantum of Solace, Daniel Craig actually lost the tip of one of his fingers and had to have it cauterized shut. And while filming Spectre, the 47-year-old Daniel Craig hurt his knee and could not do the scene that required a lot of running, and he just couldn't run. He couldn't even walk due to knee pain, and they had to shut down production for a week. And Craig felt humiliated, and he felt guilty for holding up production, and he felt that he let everyone down.
And over the films, what's the worst injury you've had?
Probably my knee, which was on Spectre, which was, that was Dave Bautista, God bless him, who is a professional wrestler.
However, in August 2017, on the Stephen Colbert Show, Daniel Craig officially announced to a massive audience applause that he would be returning as James Bond in his fifth and last James Bond movie.
Daniel Craig, we could use some good news here. Daniel Craig, will you return as James Bond?
Yes.
Thanks so much. Daniel Craig, everybody.
When asked about his comment about slashing his wrists rather than playing Bond again, he said,
Someone gave me a good analogy, which is that if you were asked 200 meters from the end of a marathon whether you'd run another marathon, you'd be fairly short and sweet about the answer, which is what I was.
Sam Mendes officially announced that he would not return for Bond 25. In interviews as early as 2015, you can read that Sam Mendes talking about how he was exhausted after filming Spectre and how the mixed reaction to the film really bummed him out. So who would direct? Well, with Sam Mendes out, Eon Productions considered Christopher Nolan. But that eventually did not work out, and several directors were approached to direct, including Yann Demange, who directed the TV show Lovecraft Country. David Mackenzie, who directed the Academy Award-nominated Hell or High Water, was considered, and Denis Villeneuve was interested in directing a Bond film, but had commitments to the 2021 film Dune. Incidentally, Denis Villeneuve has been tasked with directing the next Bond film under Amazon. Now in February 2018, Danny Boyle was established as a frontrunner for the directing position. And Boyle's original pitch to Broccoli and Wilson saw John Hodge writing a screenplay based on his idea, throwing out Neal Purvis and Robert Wade's original script. Danny Boyle's story was to be set in Russia, and the villain would be a cold and charismatic Russian who had a small army of Maori warriors as his henchmen. Also, Daniel Craig had already negotiated with Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson that James Bond would die at the end of the film, so this was also introduced in that story. John Hodge's draft was greenlit, and Boyle was confirmed to direct with a production start date of December 2018 with a planned November 2019 release date. And this would have marked a 4-year gap from Spectre. However, about 3 months before they were scheduled to start filming, in August 2018, director Danny Boyle and screenwriter John Hodge left the production over creative differences. And to this day, we don't know specifically why they left the project. And initially they reported that Boyle left because he wanted to cast Thomas Scott for the lead villain, but Eon Productions didn't want to hire him. However, Boyle denied that this was the case in later interviews. Boyle has suggested in later interviews that it was over the story, but otherwise has been pretty tight-lipped about it, so no one knows the official story of why he left. However, rumors and speculation persist to this day, and the big rumor is that he left the project because he objected to Bond dying at the end of the movie. However, Daniel Craig absolutely insisted that Bond had to die at the end, and Boyle just didn't like that idea. Again, this is totally a rumor and mere speculation, but if it is true, I totally side with Danny Boyle and support him leaving the project. In September 2018, Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson were able to find a director in Cary Joji Fukunaga. And Fukunaga was an American director who was best known for his Netflix movie Beasts of No Nation and for directing the first season of True Detective, the season with Woody Harrelson and Matthew McConaughey. He would mark the first time an American directed an official Eon production of a James Bond movie. Because remember, American Irvin Kershner directed the non-Eon Never Say Never Again. Cary Joji Fukunaga was a huge James Bond fan and had always dreamed of directing a 007 film. Now, the first James Bond film he saw in the theaters? He was 9 years old when he saw A View to a Kill, the movie that made him fall in love with the 007 franchise. Linus Sandgren, who was a cinematographer on American Hustle and La La Land, was hired as cinematographer here. And it was Emma Stone, who had worked with Fukunaga on the 2018 film Maniac, that recommended Sandgren for the job. And Neal Purvis and Robert Wade were brought back in to work on the official screenplay with director Cary Joji Fukunaga. And Cary Joji Fukunaga had a vision to return to the James Bond of the Ian Fleming novels. Because Fukunaga felt that while the James Bonds, as portrayed by Sean Connery, Roger Moore, and Pierce Brosnan, were all wonderful characters, the world had never seen the James Bond of the Fleming novels. And he felt that the Bond movies up to that point had just been escapist fantasy, and Fukunaga wanted to return to Ian Fleming's original novels and short stories to emphasize the damage and conflict within the 007 character. And his script aimed to tell a story that was more about relationships and family and focused on Bond as a wounded animal grappling with his role in a changing world. The years as a spy have taken its toll on Bond's psyche, and we see a vulnerable and broken man. Fukunaga's 007 would be an introspective character with a dirty and dangerous past and a conscience burdened by his actions. And just as Ian Fleming placed his hero in the uncertain world of the post-World War II Cold War era, similarly Fukunaga placed his hero in the uncertain world of the emerging advanced technologies and asymmetric biological warfare like bioengineered viruses. And rather than focus on Bond saving the world from a megalomaniac, Fukunaga wanted to focus on Bond's relationship with his friends like Moneypenny M&Q and his relationship with his love, Madeline Swan, and his attempts to make a family. And you can definitely see what Fukunaga was going for in the final product of No Time to Die. Remember, Cary Joji Fukunaga wanted to base his movie on the Ian Fleming novels, and more specifically on one particular Ian Fleming novel. No Time to Die is actually loosely based on Ian Fleming's 11th novel, You Only Live Twice. And that book actually concluded what was known as the Blofeld trilogy of Thunderball, On Her Majesty's Secret Service, concluding with You Only Live Twice. Now remember, the movies do not follow the order of the novels. In the movies, You Only Live Twice comes first, and Bond meets Blofeld, but then in the next movie, On Her Majesty's Secret Service, James Bond actually meets Blofeld again, but for the first time. And that's because On Her Majesty's Secret Service was closely following the novel. In the book, You Only Live Twice comes after On Her Majesty's Secret Service, after Blofeld murders his wife, Tracy Bond. And here, Bond is depressed and he lets his life slide. He's drinking, gambling, and he's just in despair, and M actually plans to dismiss Bond from the Secret Service. But M decides to give Bond one last assignment, a chance to redeem himself, and his mission is to go to Japan and convince their top secret head, a man named Tiger Tanaka, to help MI6. And while in Japan, Tiger Tanaka initially refuses, but agrees to help MI6 if James Bond will help him assassinate a man named Dr. Guntham Shatterhand, who lives in this rebuilt ancient Japanese castle called the Garden of Death on the island of Kyushu, where apparently the people of Japan are flocking there to commit suicide. And Bond investigates and discovers that Dr. Shatterhand is really Ernst Stavro Blofeld, and he therefore accepts the mission in order to get close to Blofeld and murder him and extract revenge for the murder of his wife. And so Tiger Tanaka helps Bond disguise himself as a Japanese coal miner named Taro Todoroki, and Tanaka hires a Japanese film star named Kissy Suzuki to help him pull off the disguise. And so this is an element that's similar to the movie. So Bond infiltrates Blofeld's castle, aka the Garden of Death, where he finds Blofeld spending his time dressed in a samurai armor and mask. And so you can see the elements similar to this movie. And Bond has a duel with Blofeld, and Blofeld actually uses a samurai sword while Bond uses a wooden staff. But Bond wins, and he chokes Blofeld to death while saying, "Die, Blofeld, die." And this scene is homaged in this movie when James Bond chokes Blofeld in his prison cell. Bond blows up the castle, but he barely escapes, and while escaping, he suffers a head injury that leaves him in a state of amnesia, and therefore decides to wander Japan, living his life as an amnesiac fisherman in Japan. And Agent Kissy Suzuki finds him and decides not to tell him who he is, and just lets him live in Japan with her. So the entire world believes that James Bond is dead, and they even print his obituary in the newspapers. Hence the title, You Only Live Twice. Kissy Suzuki and James Bond, aka Taro Todoroki, are living happily in Japan as poor fishermen, and Kissy Suzuki becomes pregnant with James Bond's child. However, James Bond reads this headline in the newspaper about Russia, and then it begins to haunt him, and he begins to suspect that by going to Russia, he may resolve his amnesia and find out who he truly is. He leaves Kissy Suzuki and heads for Russia, thereby leading into Ian Fleming's 12th and final novel, The Man with the Golden Gun. And so you can actually see the elements that made it into the Sean Connery movie, You Only Live Twice, but you can also see elements that are homaged in this movie. It is rumored that in the original script, Saffin's character may have actually been named Dr. Shatterhand, and the working title of this movie was Shatterhand. Interestingly, Shatterhand was also the working title for the Pierce Brosnan film Tomorrow Never Dies, making it one of the few titles to serve 2 James Bond movies. So perhaps in some early concept, Saffin was supposed to be a version of Blofeld. However, there's a more interesting idea of who Saffin was really supposed to be, because in early drafts, it is rumored that Saffin was supposed to be either Dr. No or Dr. No's son. And there are a lot of clues in this movie that suggest that this may have been the case. First, the opening of the movie has the colorful circular motifs that are directly borrowed from Dr. No. Also, Saffin's narcissistic god complex is very similar to Dr. No, and both are portrayed as being very mild-mannered, which leaves you very disconcerted. And they both have similar plans to dominate the world. If they weren't supposed to be the same character, it's certainly odd that you can easily replace one for the other in either movie. Also, Dr. Julius No is half German and half Chinese, and was played by Caucasian Joseph Wiseman, whereas Lyutsifer Safin is supposed to be half Russian and half Japanese. Incidentally, Rami Malek is of Egyptian Arab descent. So Dr. No is half German and half Chinese, and Saffin is half Russian and half Japanese? Yeah, not too different. Now, I don't want to imply that Germany and Russia are the same, nor is China the same as Japan, but if you have a German-Chinese character and you need to change it fast, I can see a Hollywood writer choosing Russian-Japanese. So, come on. Saffin was totally Dr. No. Second, like Dr. No, who had an island lair, Saffin also has an island fortress, and in Saffin's castle, his men wear the same red outfits that Dr. No's men wore, and Saffin's scientist wears the distinct containment suit that Dr. No wore. And Saffin also wears the Japanese mask that is known in Japan as the No Mask. And remember in the movie Dr. No? Dr. No was the number 2 agent at Spectre. And so you have that Blofeld connection right there as well. And the fact that Saffin was really supposed to be Dr. No may also explain why the character was so underwritten. Because if he were Dr. No, you don't have to flesh him out because his backstory is already in the lore of the character. However, for whatever reason, the filmmakers, including director Cary Fukunaga and producers Barbara Broccoli and Michael J. Wilson, lost the nerve and decided not to make him Dr. No and change his name to Saffin. And the quick last-minute change of the name may also explain the ridiculous, all-too-on-the-nose name of Lyutsifer Safin. You named your villain Lucifer? Come on. And Saffin is actually Satan. So the villain of this movie is named Lyutsifer Satan? That is so ridiculous that it makes me certain that they had to have changed the name at the last minute, and they didn't have time to think of a better name. There are speculative rumors that the producers may have been too worried to make the villain Dr. No, that it may come off like a cheap gag and backfire worse than the previous idea of Blofeld being Bond's brother. And therefore they decided to scrap the idea altogether at the last minute. However, Cary Joji Fukunaga has been very adamant in interviews that Saffin was never supposed to be Dr. No, but personally, I just don't believe him. So in September of 2018, Cary Joji Fukunaga, Neal, Purvis, and Robert Wade finished the script for Bond 25. Then 2 months later, Paul Haggis, who helped write both Casino Royale and the first Quantum of Solace script, was brought in to fix up the script. And then, a few months later after that, in February of 2019, screenwriter Scott Z. Burns, who had written the 2007 Bourne Ultimatum and had done uncredited rewrites on Star Wars Rogue One, was brought in to fix up that final script. Then Daniel Craig recommended Phoebe Waller-Bridge to come in and punch up the final script to add more humor into the dialogue and add more dimension to the female characters, namely the female 007 Nomi and Paloma. Now, this was early 2019, and Phoebe Waller-Bridge was basically known for her show Fleabag, which she created and wrote, and at this time she was generally regarded as one of the best comedic dialogue writers in show business. She had just voiced the droid L337 in Solo: A Star Wars Story and had written the award-winning show Killing Eve. And at this time, she was on the cusp of stardom. Now, this would be a few years before she would star as the much maligned Helena Shaw in Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, arguably one of the least likable heroines in modern cinema. The first character she worked on was Nomi, the replacement 007, who was a rather bland character in the previous scripts. And Waller-Bridge added more dimension to her character and made her have an edge where she's always out to prove herself. And yes, it was likely that Phoebe Waller-Bridge created the line, "Get in my way and I'll put a bullet in your knee," the one that works, igniting a massive internet backlash. But we'll talk about that in a few seconds.
You get in my way, I will put a bullet in your knee.
In the previous versions of the script, Paloma was the female contact that James Bond meets in Cuba, who helps him take down the agents of Spectre, and Fukunaga created the character specifically for Ana de Armas. However, the character may have been more bland in her dialogue, and it was Phoebe Waller-Bridge who made her very quirky and gave her the witty and memorable dialogue. In the original script for the film, Saffin, who is Russian in the original script, wore a Siberian bear hunting mask. And a Siberian bear hunting mask has spikes, sort of almost like Pinhead in Hellraiser. However, director Fukunaga felt that the mask over-dominated the character of Saffin and decided to change it to the more subtler and much softer Nogaku theater mask, otherwise known as the No mask. For the role of the new 007 Nomi, the producers originally wanted Lupita Nyong'o, who would have been awesome. And I think she would have been perfect because you really want someone beautiful and charismatic for that role. But unfortunately, she was committed to 2 movies, the movie 355 and The Killer, and she could not get out of it. And so ultimately they hired Lashana Lynch. And Lashana Lynch had not seen a single James Bond movie before, so when she was cast in the role, she binge-watched every single 007 movie from Dr. No all the way to Spectre. Now, originally they had planned to start filming in December 2018, but due to changes in director, principal filming was postponed until April of 2019, with a projected release date of February 2020, which would again be delayed to April 2020. And this may have been due to the trailer. Because you see, in December 2019, the first trailer for No Time to Die was released, and it caused a lot of controversy. Because basically you had James Bond being humiliated because he is long forgotten and no one recognizes him. And meanwhile, you have the new 007, a strong female who disrespects him and tells Bond,
You get in my way, I will put a bullet in your knee.
and it came across as incredibly disrespectful and really off-putting and obnoxious. Remember, this was at the height of the trend where Hollywood was, let's say, fighting the male patriarchy and replacing them with artificially strong female characters, who don't need no man. This meant that basically Hollywood was taking our treasured heroes and having them humiliated and replaced by these strong female characters. The quintessential of which was Star Wars The Last Jedi, which humiliated Luke Skywalker and tried to replace him with the strong female Rey. We saw it happen again in Terminator Dark Fate. We saw it happen with Kevin Smith's 2021 Masters of the Universe reboot, Masters of the Universe Revelation. And we would see it again the next year in Indiana Jones and a Dial of Destiny, where Phoebe Waller-Bridge would disrespect our beloved Indiana Jones at every turn, to the fans' utter disgust. And likewise here, fans were very upset that James Bond was going to be humiliated in his own movie. And the online outcry by fans was very loud, and much of it was directed at the new 007, the strong female character. And let's face it, the trailer was hard to refute. And so the movie got delayed, which was believed to be no doubt that the filmmakers would smartly use the time to reshoot and fix some of those off-putting, obnoxious scenes. Now remember, No Time to Die was originally supposed to come out in November 2019, and it was postponed until February 2020, and then April 2020, and then came the pandemic. And then this movie got delayed even further, indefinitely. So we had the pandemic, and most of the theaters closed. Disney sold their movies on Disney+, Warner Brothers put all their movies on HBO Max for free, and many other movies just waited, and No Time to Die was one of them. And then as the pandemic was slowly winding down and theaters were opening back up again, this movie kept getting pushed back. And then finally, October 8th, 2021, No Time to Die was finally released. This made it 6 years after the last film, Spectre, which was released in 2015, making it one of the longest gaps between Bond films. Although today 6 years doesn't seem so bad, considering it's been 6 years since No Time to Die, and Amazon hasn't even cast the new James Bond yet. But at that time, a 6-year gap was a huge deal. And this would also make Daniel Craig's run as Bond last from 2006 to 2021, making it a 15-year run, making his tenure as Bond the longest of any James Bond actor. Roger Moore held the previous record, playing Bond for 12 years from 1973 to 1985. Pierce Brosnan played him from 1995 to 2002 for 7 years. And Sean Connery had played Bond from 1962 to 1971, making it a 9-year run. Although, if you include the unofficial Never Say Never Again in 1983, his run would be 21 years. Now, I remember when I saw this movie in the theaters, it was after work on a Friday, and the whole office went out for drinks, and my friend and coworker Gary and I were hanging out, and we realized, hey, the latest James Bond movie came out. And I asked him, hey, want to go see the new James Bond film? And he agreed, and we both went to see it. And I have to admit, I loved it until the ending. So this movie begs the question, can an ending completely ruin an otherwise great film? Because I was really enjoying the movie. I loved the opening teaser, insanely action-packed and truly heartbreaking. I love the chemistry between James Bond and Madeline Swan. I love the action. I love the character of Paloma in Cuba, and that was an amazing scene, and I absolutely loved her. And I thought she was obviously the breakout character of this series, although I thought her time in the movie was way too short. I also liked the idea that this was about a manufactured virus that could wipe out, well, not a virus, wink wink, but manufactured nanobots that could wipe out populations of people. I thought it was very topical. And I was pleasantly surprised that Nomi, Lashana Lynch's 007 character, was not as obnoxious or off-putting as the trailer suggested. And James Bond was not disrespected in his own movie. In fact, between he and Nomi, Bond gave as much as he got, and most of the time, he won those exchanges. And I loved how Nomi slowly began to respect James Bond, and by the end of the movie, Bond was a mentor to her. And the moment where Nomi gives up her 007 designation to James Bond, the theater I was in applauded. And at that moment, my friend Gary and I gave each other a high five. And after the movie, I was left wondering how much of Nomi's respect for Bond was in the original concept, and how much of what we saw on screen was from reshoots as a reaction to the fan backlash after the first trailer. Regardless, they did a great job of making her much more likable than we feared from that trailer. And then we had James Bond and Nomi make their final assault on Saffin's castle, and this was a spectacular, heart-pounding, on the edge of your seat action sequence. And I was loving this movie, and I really thought that I was seeing a top-tier Bond movie. And I started wondering in my head where I'd rank this movie in the ranking of Bond films, certainly in my top 5. This was turning out to be the perfect swan song for 007, and I was certain that Daniel Craig's legacy as James Bond was secured. And then suddenly, almost without warning, Bond dies at the end of the movie.
What?
I was shocked. My friend Gary was shocked. Neither of us could process what had just happened on screen, and neither one of us spoke. We trudged out of the theater in silence as if we'd both been kicked in the stomach. And then I remember saying to him, I didn't want James Bond to die. Then days passed and I spent time thinking about the movie, and I did realize that I missed all the references to his death. I'd missed seeing the foreshadowing of death sprinkled everywhere throughout the movie. Because you had the destruction of Spectre, you had the death of Felix Leiter, you had the death of Blofeld, and you even got to see the birth of James Bond's child. And these were all foreshadowing his death. And, well, since then, this movie has become very polarizing. Well, maybe not the movie. I think everyone can agree that the movie was technically very well made. Until that death scene. It was fantastic and a worthy James Bond film. The polarization is with Bond's death. And some critics thought it was great and saw it as the perfect story arc for the character of James Bond and a brilliant ending to Daniel Craig's run as 007, while just as many hated the ending and feared it was the beginning of the end for the 007 franchise. And at first, I started understanding why they killed him. Bond is the story about a broken man. He's a man haunted all his life. His life has been death and betrayal and pain. And finally, at the end of his life, he's able to sacrifice his own life in order to save his own daughter. And that's a nice character arc. And many say it's the perfect ending to his story. Well, I ultimately landed on my original assessment that I didn't want him to die. There's a famous quote that says, ambiguity elevates art, and I think it could have applied to this movie. Imagine if they made James Bond's death a little more ambiguous. Let your brain wonder if he maybe survived. You still could have the same story, he's blown up. You just don't show him disintegrating in the hail of missiles. Make it ambiguous. And the audience could think, well, maybe he jumped in the water at the last minute. Maybe he could have survived. And then when Madeleine Swann talks to his daughter about James Bond, then in the distance, you can almost imagine Bond watching over them like a guardian angel. Ooh, that idea gives me chills. Now, one of the things that this movie did, like Spectre and Die Another Day, was that it peppered the movie with references to other past James Bond movies. Now, for one, this movie was heavy with references from Dr. No, but then again, I feel that was because Saffin was supposed to be Dr. No. But second, there were other heavy references to On Her Majesty's Secret Service, with the use of Louis Armstrong's haunting musical theme, We Have All the Time in the World. But other than that, there are other small references to every other 007 movie. And I'll mention every one that I've noticed in the section below. But there is one movie that absolutely gets no reference in this movie, and that is A View to a Kill. However, the filmmakers had actually planned a huge reference to A View to a Kill. In the Jamaica scene, Grace Jones, who played Mayday, who is Jamaican, wants to have a cameo in the Jamaican nightclub, and that would have been amazing. Grace Jones was approached, but she was insulted at how small and how short her cameo was, and declined to take part in the movie. But oh man, that would have been such a great cameo. Incidentally, both Nomi's Lashana Lynch and Moneypenny's Naomi Harris have Jamaican roots. Well, let's talk about the movie. So once again, we actually get a traditional gun barrel scene, and this is only the second time in the entire Daniel Craig James Bond series that we actually get the standard gun barrel scene at the start of the movie. However, after Bond shoots, we do not get the dripping blood. And this was the first time in the history of the gun barrel sequence that we don't get the dripping blood. In other words, Bond does not kill his intended target, he loses the duel. And this is supposed to be the first clue that foreshadows that Bond will die at the end of the movie. And then we jump to the pre-credit action sequence, but we actually don't get James Bond, fighting bad guys. We get this teenage girl being hunted by an assassin in a creepy no mask. sort of evoking a kind of horror slasher movie. And we presume that this teenage girl is Madeline Swan. And Madeline's father is Mr. White from the previous movies, who is an assassin who apparently killed this masked man's family. So we are in a flashback in the mid-90s, and presumably 1995 because of the Tamagotchi little toy. And I remember these being really popular back in 1995. And apparently Mr. White assassinated Saffin's entire family, and the agent used to kill Saffin's family was ricin, which we know from modern times causes severe deformities in the face. The entire family was killed, but the teenage son, Saffin, Rami Malek's character, actually survived, and that's why he has that deformity in his face in the opening scene. That distinct scarring is pathognomonic for ricin poisoning. And being the only survival of this assassination attempt, Saffin decides to exact his revenge by killing Mr. White's family. And Madeline Swan is able to survive and run off, but she falls in the lake, and actually, Saffin saves her life. And in this flashback, Saffin would have roughly been about the same age as Madeline. Rami Malek, the actor, is 38, which would make the character about 15 or 16 years old in the flashback, and Leah Sado is 36, only 2 years younger than Rami Malek, and therefore, if you take this flawed mathematic approach, she would be about 2 years younger than Saffin in the flashback, so maybe 13 or 14 years old. And so at that moment where he almost kills her, but she survives, perhaps he saw something. Perhaps he saw a little bit of himself, a lone survivor of a family-wide assassination attempt. Perhaps being the same age, he saw a connection, and in that moment had sympathy and mercy for her and let her live. The 1995 flashback ends, and we're in a time a few years after the events of Spectre, where James Bond and Madeline Swan have fallen in love and have begun their life together. Bond is retired, and he's happy, he's in love with Madeline Swan, and for a moment, we see that they are genuinely happy. But tragedy is just around the corner. And Bond tells her,
"We have all the time in the world."
Which is a reference to On Her Majesty's Secret Service, where he meets the love of his life, Teresa, they get married, and they're about to live life happily ever after. They say to each other, "We have all the time in the world."
But darling, now we have all the time in the world.
Before she is gunned down by Blofeld and his henchwoman. And as Blofeld destroyed Bond's chance at love and happiness in that movie, here too Blofeld will destroy Bond's chance at love and happiness here. And that theme of On Her Majesty's Secret Service is going to permeate through this movie, including the beautiful and haunting musical score written by Louis Armstrong, and it was the theme to On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and it runs throughout this movie. And because of that, when I first was watching this movie, I actually feared that Madeline Swan was going to be killed. But I had no idea it was actually foreshadowing a reversal, the actual death of James Bond. And even at the end of this movie, when he knows he's going to die, he actually tells Madeline Swan and his daughter,
"You have all the time in the world."
A reversal where he dies, ultimately sacrificing his life, allowing Madeline and their daughter to ultimately live. Here in Italy, Madeline encourages Bond to go to Vesper's grave so that he and Madeline can begin their life on a clean slate. But she has a secret, which is that she is pregnant with his child. But when Bond goes to Vesper's grave, it explodes and he's attacked. And I love the scene where the explosion happens and you see ringing in his ears, and it really captures what it might be like suffering an explosion. It's a nice directorial touch. It really gets you inside James Bond's mind. And the bad guys, when they telephone Madeline and say that she's the daughter of Spectre, they're just trolling James Bond, making him think that Madeline is working for Spectre. And her betrayal is totally fake, completely staged by Blofeld. But when you're watching for the first time, we really don't know. We think she might be in on it. And when you understand that she's innocent, the scene becomes so painful. And this leads to an amazing, heart-pounding action sequence. And this is all Bond. I love this action sequence because we have all the elements of what makes a great James Bond action sequence. We get a beautiful exotic locale in Matara in southern Italy. We get this menacing evil henchman with a very distinct look. Here we get Primo, aka Cyclops, a mercenary killer with a kind of odd eye, which we'll later find out is a camera through which Blofeld is controlling Spectre out of his prison cell. I love that because it's just totally old school Bond. We get so many great action elements like James Bond on a bridge, and when the cars are coming, he grabs a cable line and jumps off the bridge. We also get the amazing motorcycle chase. It finally culminates into a moment where he rides the motorcycle up the stairs and flies into the air and lands in a crowd. And that's just so awesome. And of course, this stunt was done practically. It was performed by Paul Fast Eddie Edmondson, who is a professional motorcycle enduro racer and 4-time world enduro champion. Edmondson rode up an 8-meter ramp at a speed of 37 miles an hour and became airborne. And this would become one of the signature stunts of the movie. And you can't have a proper James Bond movie without the Aston Martin DB5, with all the 007 gadgets. We get the Gatling guns we saw in Skyfall, but we get so much more. We get all the full-blown Aston Martin DB5 gadgets that we haven't seen since Goldfinger. We get the grenades, we get the landmines, we get the smoke screen, we get the bulletproof windows. It's just totally awesome. Tragically, James Bond puts Madeline Swan on a train and he says goodbye forever. And you know that she's totally innocent and she has really no idea what's going on. And it's really, really sad. And we see her grab her belly, which means we know that she knows that she's pregnant with Bond's child. And this is the essence of James Bond as the wounded animal. We see it here, a man destined to hurt the woman he loves. And this is why it is considered a heroic arc that he sacrifices his own life at the end to save her and their daughter. And from that point, at the moment of his death, he will finally know true peace. We then get the opening music montage and credits, and the opening visual montage was once again created by Daniel Kleinman, who was working on his 8th James Bond movie. And Kleinman worked with 2 motifs. The first was the opening montage of the first movie ever, Dr. No, created by Maurice Binder in 1962. So try to tell me that Saffin wasn't supposed to be Dr. No. Of course, the second motif is DNA. DNA strands that are manufactured virus targets. Manufactured nanobot targets. The song is sung by Billie Eilish, who was 18 years old at the time, making her the youngest star to sing a James Bond musical number. And she wrote the song with her brother, Phineas O'Connell, who has written all of Billie Eilish's songs. Apparently, Phineas O'Connell was a lifelong James Bond fan, and the two turned in a tape of No Time to Die. And when Hans Zimmer heard it, he loved it, and he supposedly said, "Get them on a plane and get them over here." And he used the song for the movie. Interestingly, Hans Zimmer was not Cary Fukunaga's first choice for the musical score. Originally, Fukunaga brought in Dan Romer, with whom he had worked with, together on Beasts of No Nation. But however, after working on the movie, he left the project due to creative differences, and so in January 2020, he was replaced by Hans Zimmer. Yes, Hans Zimmer scored the music for this movie. The movie proper jumps 5 years later, and we're at an MI6 laboratory, and the government is working on a secret bioweapon called Project Heracles. And it's a nanobot that codes into the target's DNA, killing them while leaving those around them completely safe. And we will later learn that it was M, Sir Mallory himself, that commissioned and oversaw the development of Heracles, a DNA-targeting nanobot bioweapon designed by Valdo Oberchev, intended to be a precise assassin's tool that M believed would minimize casualties by targeting a single person's DNA, making government-sanctioned assassinations much cleaner. Now, the MI6 scientist Waldo Oberchev is kidnapped by Spectre. And I wondered, nanobots? And you have to wonder if this line was reinserted after the fact, because why nanobots? It seems a little hokey, because I believe in the original script it was simply a manufactured man-made virus. However, with COVID-19, you can't have the plot be a government-sanctioned lab creating a virus to be the major plot of your movie during an actual viral pandemic. So you insert the term nanobots with ADR, and voila, you've created sort of a science fiction distance from the problem. So in this current time, 5 years later, after James Bond has left Madeline, Bond is hiding out alone in Jamaica, which is a nice reference to James Bond creator and writer Ian Fleming, who was also a British naval intelligence officer who spent his final days on a similar beach house in Jamaica. Now, Ian Fleming was not a field agent, but he was an intelligence officer who planned a lot of missions that were crucial in World War II. And after he retired, he moved to Jamaica, bought a 15-acre estate on the Oracabessa Bay in northern Jamaica, and built a 3-bedroom house overlooking a private beach. And he named the estate Goldeneye, and it is at Goldeneye where he wrote all of his James Bond novels. While the actual Goldeneye estate was not the location used here for the film, the actual crew as well as the principal cast actually did stay at the real Goldeneye estate during the filming of this Jamaica sequence. And I think that is totally awesome. In Jamaica, Bond is approached by his friend CIA agent Felix Leiter, who asks him to help track down and find the kidnapped Oberchef. And here we get the return of Jeffrey Wright as Felix Leiter, playing him 3 times. Now, most of the time in the franchise, Felix Leiter was played by a different actor in every movie, and the only other actor to play him twice was David Hedison, who played him once in Live and Let Die for Roger Moore, and again 16 years later in License to Kill for Timothy Dalton. Now, Felix Leiter has also an associate named Logan Ash, who is enamored with Bond, who Bond refers to as Book of Mormon because at first he appears inexperienced and kind of innocent, but then turns out to be a nefarious double agent secretly working for the villain Saffin. James Bond picks up a local woman who turns out to be the MI6 agent who replaced James Bond and took on the new mantle of 007. And here we get the scene that caused so much controversy in the trailer. She really does say,
You get in my way, I will put a bullet in your knee. The one that works.
James Bond calls them and yells at him for Project Heracles and for sending the new 007 to harass him. And Bond decides that he's going to work with Felix Leiter and the CIA. So for a second, James Bond is unofficially a CIA agent. Bond heads off to Cuba to look for Oberchef, where he meets the CIA agent named Paloma. And when we first meet her, she's drop dead stunning in that amazing dress. But she's cute and bubbly, and we assume that she's an inexperienced and innocent agent. And we think she's going to be a disaster character like Mary Goodnight. And when she gulps that vodka martini, I was certain that she was going to be killed. But our expectations are totally subverted when she's an outstanding killer. If you're going to subvert expectations, this is how to do it. And there's one moment where Paloma tells Bond,
I know. I've done 3 weeks training.
And there's actually more to that line. Ana de Armas had 3 weeks of gun training for the scene and was really worried that she wouldn't look convincing enough on screen, and she kept telling director Fukunaga, I've only had 3 weeks of training. And so Fukunaga thought that it would be funny if she actually said it in the movie. The two infiltrate a Spectre meeting celebrating the birthday of their imprisoned leader, Blofeld, who we find out is still running Spectre from his prison cell at Belmarsh Prison in London. And producer Michael G. Wilson has the cameo here as a military officer, and this is his 20th official cameo in the 007 franchise. And then Spectre, of course Blofeld, knows that Bond is here and is actually planning on killing James Bond with the nanobots, which may or may not have been the virus. But in a weird reversal, it turns out that Oberchef was really working with Saffin, and they planned to get kidnapped, and the two turn the tables on Spectre, and the virus, or nanobots, is actually set to kill Spectre agents, not James Bond. Bond and Paloma capture Oberchef, but meanwhile, all around them, the nanobots are murdering all of the members of Spectre. And this leads to a spectacular action sequence. The sequence where Bond and Paloma fight off Saffin and Spectre's goons, and Paloma is amazing. And then 007 Nomi appears, and she kind of stays on the side working as both an ally and an opponent, because she's working against Bond and Paloma by trying to kidnap Oberchef, but she's also protecting them from the shadows. It creates this weird triangular dynamic of spy work that really added to the complexity and coolness of the scene, and it just ended up being such a great action scene. And Ana de Armas was fantastic, and she is a force to be reckoned with. I couldn't take my eyes off her, and she was like this beautiful, sexy, dangerous female John Wick, and no doubt led to the creation of her movie Ballerina, which incidentally was excellent and probably deserved to do much better than it did at the box office. And at the end of the fight, Bond compliments Paloma, saying,
You were excellent.
And we know exactly how he feels. Ana de Armas completely stole the show, and I have to admit, when I saw the movie, I actually didn't recognize her, because she played the timid and mousy lead in Rian Johnson's Knives Out. She played the immigrant nurse, Marta de Carrera, co-starring with Daniel Craig as Detective Benoit Blanc. And it was Daniel Craig who recommended that Ana de Armas be in this movie, and Cary Fukunaga wrote Paloma specifically for her. And apparently in the original script, there was going to be kind of a love triangle subplot between Bond and Paloma, and I would have wanted to see that. But producers claim that apparently it didn't test well, and they left it out. Although I can also believe that Phoebe Waller-Bridge removed any romance angle from the script. Who knows what really happened, and I'm just speculating. Bond takes Oberchef to Felix Leiter, and here we learn that Logan Ash is a bad guy, a double agent working for Saffin, and Ash shoots Felix Leiter in the stomach. And then Logan blows a hole in their boat and sinks it, while he and Oberchef fly off to safety. And Felix dies in Bond's arms, and as they drown in the boat, the scene evokes the way Vesper died in Venice. And this was quite a shock. I didn't want Felix to die. But as the boat sinks, Bond narrowly escapes. And Bond survives and sits in a yellow life raft awaiting rescue, which is the same yellow life raft from Thunderball and You Only Live Twice. However, in both those movies, he got to wait for rescue with beautiful women, but here he must wait alone, reflecting on his loss. So James Bond heads back to London and into a safe house storage where he retrieves his 1987 Aston Martin V8 Mark IV. And this was the same Aston Martin that Timothy Dalton's Bond used in The Living Daylights. And when he gets out of the car in his impeccable gray suit and sunglasses, he looks incredible, and it's an awesome James Bond moment. And it's no wonder that it's become the celebrated screenshot for this movie. Now back at MI6, no one seems to recognize him. And while in London, Bond decides to stay at Q's place. And I love this idea that James Bond is friends with Moneypenny and Q, and that they have his back when needed. And it's an homage to Q helping Bond in License to Kill, and a continuation of Bond and Moneypenny, Q, and Tanner working together off the books in Spectre. We then jump to Madeline Swan, who is visited by the main villain in this movie, Saffin, and we officially meet him for the first time. And he has a very calm and creepy way of speaking that I imagine must have been his way of evoking Dr. Julius No. Because I'm telling you, Saffin was supposed to be Dr. No before they changed it at the last minute. And he tells Madeline that he was the man in the No mask who saved him in the lake. And he convinces Madeline to help assassinate Blofeld by wearing the perfume that has the virus or nanobot that will target Blofeld's DNA. And meanwhile, Bond decides to interview Ernst Stavro Blofeld in his prison cell at Belmarsh, but there he runs into Madeline Swan. And when Blofeld is carted out to Bond, the scene evokes Hannibal Lecter being introduced from his prison cell, which would have been very much more effective if Blofeld hadn't been portrayed as a petty, jealous goofball in the last movie. However, because James Bond is there, Madeline Swan can't do it and she leaves, but Bond grabs her arm and gets the nanovirus on him. And Blofeld tells Bond that he framed Madeline in Italy and she was innocent, and so he broke up with her for nothing. And Blofeld totally gets under Bond's skin, and Bond loses his temper and grabs Blofeld to choke him and says the line, "Die, Blofeld, die." The line from the novel You Only Live Twice, where Bond chokes Blofeld to death. However, Bond composes himself, decides not to kill Blofeld, although it's too late. The nanobots from his arm actually has landed on Blofeld and thereby kills him. So Saffin has managed the destruction of Spectre and the death of Blofeld, and that's a very impressive feat, which should have made him a very threatening villain, but to be honest, I just don't feel it. So Bond next goes to Norway to track down Madeline's childhood home, and we recognize it from the pre-credit sequence. And they have a really nice, touching moment, and Bond professes his love for Swan, and it's a very effective scene. I really believe that he loves her. And then he finds out that Madeline has a daughter, Matilda, and he suspects that he could be his daughter. The timing is right. She has his eyes. But Madeline denies it, but we all know that she's Bond's daughter. And we get this nice scene in the morning where Bond slices apples for his daughter, and they have a really nice domestic moment. And the child actress playing Matilda really does look like a female toddler version of Daniel Craig. She's played by Lisa Dorosanet, who played the role at the age of 5. M calls Bond, and Nomi is also oddly in Norway since she's pursuing Logan Ash, and Bond puts 2 and 2 together and realizes that Logan Ash and Saffin are on their way trying to kidnap Madeline and Mathilde. Bond, Madeline, and Mathilde take off in her 1990 Toyota Land Cruiser Prado J90, knowing that Ash will be appearing soon, and it's a very tense scene. And they cross over a fantastic-looking bridge which really exists in real life in Norway. It is the Storsesjønut Bridge, also known as the Bridge to Nowhere, also known as the Drunken Bridge, and it's famous for its peculiar shape that gives the illusion that it ends in nothingness. It's a beautiful, exotic locale. And sure enough, Saffin and his men show up in Land Rovers and a helicopter. And this is the Land Rover Defender, which was a product placement deal which was featured in a series of Land Rover commercials at the time. And they even created a James Bond edition of the Land Rover to coincide with the release of this movie. And this leads to the third spectacular action sequence. And this was a lot of fun because Bond in his Toyota Jeep single-handedly takes on an army of Saffin soldiers who are chasing in Land Rovers. It's spectacular and eventually leads to a smoky forest. And Madeline even takes out a few of the men. Bond draws the men away from Madeline and Mathilde, and he systematically picks them off one by one. He uses a grenade to destroy one Land Rover, and then uses the tow cables to set a trap for the motorcycles. And then he captures Logan Ash, and when Ash begs for mercy, he tells him that he's avenging Felix Leiter, and he crushes Logan Ash with the Land Rover. And this is a reference to Roger Moore kicking off Locke off a cliff and avenging Ferrara. But ultimately, Saffin has been able to capture Madeline and Mathilde, and Bond has failed, and Nomi picks up Bond in her 2018 Aston Martin Superleggera. Bond goes back to MI6 where he and Nomi plan to infiltrate Saffin's castle, and Saffin's headquarters is an old World War II base between Japan and Russia. And here we get the scene where Nomi, the new 007, offers to give up her 007 status and give it back to Bond.
Permission for Commander Bond to be redesignated as 007. It's just a number.
Very well. Agreed.
And it's an awesome little scene, and it completely redeems this character in the audience's eyes. Nomi fully wins us over. It's her save the cat moment, and now we, the audience, are on her side as she and Bond set out to infiltrate Saffin's fortress. We then go to Saffin's castle where we follow Saffin through his fortress, which is processing his nanobots that are totally not viruses. And we see all the workers are afraid of him and they jump up in deference. Now, if that's not a Dr. No trait, I don't know what is. He takes Madeline and Mathilde to his poison garden and he gives them his villain monologue. And this poison garden is a reference to Blofeld, who had a similar poison garden in a novel, You Only Live Twice. And he tells her that his intent is to keep Madeline and Mathilde on the island fortress forever. Bond and Nomi get into a plane designed by Q, and I thought this little jet that they use was really cool. And the drop evokes James Bond doing the halo jump in Tomorrow Never Dies, but then the wings unfold, and it's a really cool airplane that somewhat evokes the Acrostar in Octopussy. But then it dives into the water, folds its wings, and it's a submarine. So you had a car that turns into a submarine in The Spy Who Loved Me, and here you get a jet that turns into a submarine. And when they get into Saffin's fortress, it evokes Stromberg's ship in The Spy Who Loved Me. And this is going to lead to the fourth and final action sequence, which is just awesome. And with the two of them working together, they are an unstoppable force of nature, just plowing through Saffin's army. And this action sequence is worthy of the best of Bond. And it's really some of the best action sequences out there. Then we get this really cool homage, because we're in a long circular hallway, and Bond turns around, and we get a visual homage to the gun barrel sequence. And I thought that was a really cool touch. And the two learn that Saffin and his army has a plan to release a massive amount of nanobots, a nanobot pandemic to kill millions of people across the world. So is Saffin's plan to pull a Thanos and reduce the population of Earth, making it easier for others to survive? Well, if you look at the simulation, most of the people killed are in Western Europe and the United States. Saffin, who is half Russian and half Japanese, may be creating a new world order where Western Europe and the United States are decimated, leaving Russia and the Asian powers, of which he is a line, to thrive and rule the planet. And now that we know Saffin's full plan, I still can't help thinking that Saffin just seems underdeveloped, and I have my opinions as to why. So keep in mind this is only my opinion, and it's solely speculation. Well, first, obviously he was supposed to be Dr. Julius No, but secondly, I think there were more scenes where Dr. No, aka Saffin, would have had a monologue about the importance of viruses and why he had such a passion for viruses. And I think these monologues may have fleshed out the character a little more. However, with the pandemic, you can't glorify a virus, and so with a change of virus to nanobots, they simply remove the pro-virus monologue, leaving Saffin to be seemingly woefully underwritten. Now, meanwhile, Madeline escapes the clutches of Primo, aka Cyclops, and while Bond faces off with Saffin, who's holding Mathilde, here Saffin says,
"So here I am, their invisible god, sneaking under their skin."
And Bond responds,
"You know that history isn't kind to those who play God."
And I love that when Bond gives Saffin what he wants, which is to see him groveling and bowing at him, he's playing to Saffin's ego. But then he secretly grabs his gun and kills Saffin's guards. But Saffin's able to escape with a hidden trapdoor. Then Matilda bites Saffin and then runs off alone. Nomi takes Oberchev hostage, and Nomi has finally had enough of him and kills Oberchev by throwing him into the acid. Nomi is able to escape the island with Madeline and Mathilde, and she takes them to safety. Bond has his one-on-one fight with Primo and uses his EMP watch to blow up Primo's eye camera. And he tells Q,
"I just shot someone your watch. Really blew their mind."
Bond has M call in a missile strike from the HMS Dragon, while he has opened up the blast doors to allow the missiles to come in and destroy Saffin's fortress. The missile strike is ordered, and Bond has almost succeeded. He's pretty much won. However, all of a sudden, at the last minute, Saffin closes the doors, so the missiles are likely to just bounce off, leaving his headquarters intact. Since suddenly we have this entire victory just yanked out from under us, so Bond decides to go back into the belly of the beast. He meets Saffin, who shoots him in the shoulder, and then Bond wrestles with Saffin and breaks his arm, but Saffin is able to infect James Bond with the nanobots, which means that Bond will kill his daughter if he ever gets near her. Plus, he has very little time to reopen the hatch and escape, so Bond just shoots Saffin in the head, and it's a very cold-blooded but efficient scene. Bond realizes that he's not going to make it and decides to sacrifice himself to save Madeline and Mathilde. He says,
"No, I'm not going to make it."
And he opens the hatch and the missiles come in. But Bond understands that he's infected with a virus and that he must destroy himself for his daughter and Madeline to survive. And I was stunned. And he says the line right before his death,
"You have all the time in the world."
And then, in case you have any doubts, she confirms that Matilda has his father's eyes. And you see the joy and peace in Bond. Just before the missiles destroy the fortress, we see Bond explode and disintegrate to death in a hail of missiles. And the movie ends with M, Q, Moneypenny, Nomi, and Bill Tanner having a drink in James Bond's honor, while Madeline tells Mathilde about her father, James Bond, thus a fitting close to the epic life of Daniel Craig's James Bond. And then we get Louis Armstrong's song, "We Have All the Time in the World." And it's not a bad ending. I guess if you're really motivated to kill James Bond, I guess this was the best way to do it. Still, I think it was a mistake. I think the filmmakers missed the point of James Bond and what makes him such a great character. James Bond is not a real character. James Bond is not a character study. In my humble opinion, I think what makes James Bond such a great character is that he's the mythic archetype of the animus hero, and it brings out and inspires the animus in ourselves. Well, let me phrase it another way. When we see James Bond on screen, we imagine ourselves as James Bond. Right? We become James Bond. Am I right? And a part of this mythic archetypal fantasy is our desire for survival. And while life is suffering and death, our mythology doesn't necessarily have to be. Just as we want to survive ourselves, we want to see James Bond survive. And I think Christopher Nolan understood this with Dark Knight Rises. And that's why I feel they made a mistake in killing Bond. They should have ended the movie where we maybe wonder if he really died. Maybe we might think we see him in the shadows protecting Madeline and Matilda from a distance. A guardian angel no longer protecting for Queen and Country, but now protecting his family. That's a mythic archetypal fantasy that could inspire us. No Time to Die had its world premiere at the Royal Albert Hall in London on 28th of September 2021 and was released in cinemas on the 30th of September 2021 in the United Kingdom and on the 8th of October 2021 in the United States. And critically, this film received positive reviews. Critics loved this movie. On Rotten Tomatoes, it got an 83% approval rating, and CinemaScore audience poll gave it a grade of an A-. Most of the critics found it a worthy close to the Daniel Craig era of James Bond, while fan reaction may have been a little more mixed. The Washington Post gave it 3 out of 4 stars and described it as a bit too long, a bit too complicated, but added ultimately perversely satisfying send-off for the actor. Critics who didn't like the film mostly criticized the length. Empire magazine stated that the movie doesn't justify the heavy runtime, and Kyle Smith of the National Review also criticized the long runtime and said it was the least fun and most somber excursion in the entire Bond series. In terms of box office, No Time to Die made a fairly disappointing $160.9 million in the US and Canada. But fortunately, it did do better overseas and made another $613.3 million internationally, for a worldwide box office of $774.2 million. Now, this film had a budget of over $250 million, and with marketing costs approaching $100 million, the budget reached over $350 million. And it was projected that the film needed to make about $800 million to be profitable, and it almost got there with $774 million. So it was neither a massive failure, but it wasn't a success. And it likely did lose money. And here's an interesting fact. No Time to Die is the first film in the entire James Bond franchise of 25 Eon films to lose money. Now at the 94th Academy Awards, No Time to Die was nominated for 3 Academy Awards, Best Sound, Best Visual Effects, and Best Original Song, and it won an Academy Award for Best Original Song, and that would make it the 3rd consecutive Bond movie to win Best Original Song with Skyfall and Spectre. And so, with No Time to Die, we not only see the close of the Daniel Craig era, but due to unforeseen events at the time of the movie, we also see the end of the Broccoli family era. Albert Cubby Broccoli, with Harry Saltzman, started the 007 franchise in 1962 with Dr. No, and Broccoli produced every single James Bond movie until his illness in 1989's License to Kill, which was produced by his stepson, Michael G. Wilson. And in 1995, with GoldenEye, his daughter Barbara Broccoli officially took over as co-producer with her half-brother Michael G. Wilson. And the two produced every James Bond movie since. However, in March 2022, Amazon acquired MGM, who owned half of the James Bond property. However, Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson could not get past the stalemate with Amazon on the direction of the 007 franchise, so Amazon made them an offer they could not refuse. Amazon paid Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson a whopping $1 billion for the creative rights to the 007 movies. The Broccoli family still owns half of the brand and half of the profits, but now Amazon has 100% of the creative rights. So whatever James Bond movie or spin-off or streaming show that we see is 100% Amazon without any creative contribution from Barbara Broccoli nor Michael G. Wilson. And let's face it, I'm a little bit afraid. But let's see where they take it. They did hire Denis Villeneuve as a director for Bond 26, so that's a step in the right direction. And let's see who they cast as James Bond. And I can't believe it, but with No Time to Die, we come to the final film in our year-long James Bond retrospective. When I started my James Bond series, I just started my YouTube channel and only had a handful of subscribers, and here we are. Thanks to everyone here, I am now a full-blown legitimate YouTube channel, and I have to thank all of you for helping make this dream a reality. So now that I'm done with the 007 series, I'm kind of uncertain where to go from here. When I started my James Bond series, it was a break from my Star Trek retrospective. So I guess I'll pick off where I left there, continue with Star Trek Generations and Star Trek First Contact, then Insurrections and Nemesis. After the Star Trek, I'd originally planned to do the Superman films, the one with Christopher Reeve, and then the Batman movies. And then after that, I'm curious, what would you like me to do? I think most fans have been asking me to do maybe both of the Mission Impossible films and the Jason Bourne series. Other fans have asked for Lord of the Rings, and a few have asked for me to talk about the Bruce Lee films. So those are on the agenda in the future. But I want to ask you to put in the comments what you would like to see me do in the future. And I really just want to thank you all for your incredible support. That ends this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you had a great time.